Thank you. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Let me take you back to 1850 in David Copperfield, where Mr. Micawber once said, annual income £20, annual expenditure £19 and 6, result, happiness. Annual income £20, annual expenditure £20 naught and 6, result, misery. With this budget, the Treasurer, Joe Hockey, seems to have been able to create the misery, but even trying to balance his budget. And tonight we'll cover on a few issues. The personal tax changes, of which there are a few, the business tax changes, some other matters that may be of interest, and then finally I'll open up to discussion and then probably more for questions afterwards. What should have been, what we should really be discussing, because the budget has largely been done and dusted, and the only thing we now need to know is to roll the dice to see what he can get through on both the Senate and the House of Reps, if some of his backbenchers are now getting nervous. So, and this isn't working, is it? There we go. How's that? So that's the agenda. Look, the personal tax reform, personal tax is by far the largest take of the federal budget. So therefore, any changes to personal tax will inevitably have a wide-ranging impact. Now, the major measures that are up there, the first one is the budget repair levy. If you have a taxable income greater than $180,000, yes, from 1 July this year, you'll pay an additional 2%. And that's a temporary measure, in brackets, temporary, for 3 years. And this is part of sharing the pain, so-called. The FBT rate, the fringe benefits tax rate, to match the increase in the personal tax will also similarly increase by 2%. Now, because of the difference in years, the FBT rate won't go up until 1 April 2015. So automatically you've created an arbitrage of 2% between 1 July this year and 31 March next year. So for those of you earning $180,000, I'd start looking at my expense payments fringe benefits to see what you can pump through. 2% over a period of time is a fair degree of money. The family tax benefit, and again, this only applies if you're earning now less than $100,000. It was dropped down from $150,000. And the reform is this, is to try and overcome this so-called middle-class welfare. So previously, if you were earning up to $150,000, you got it. Now that rate has been, or threshold, has now been dropped to $100,000. And finally, superannuation. Well, lo and behold, we thought we came unscathed through the budget, and yet Mr. Micawber, I should say, Mr. Hockey, has come out and said, well, we're going to review superannuation by the end of this term. I guess if you don't keep any of the other promises, you might as well not keep any of them. So with that, the only changes to superannuation in the budget were, in effect, the phasing of the superannuation guarantee levy, which from 9 to 12%, there's been a minor extension of the years throughout the period. There are some other inconsequential amendments if you contribute too much money, but again, I'm happy to sort of answer that in questions. The business tax changes get a little bit more interesting, especially those for you in private businesses. The big headline changes, of course, is the drop in the corporate tax rate from 30 to 28.5%. Still well above the sort of the target rate of 25% that a lot of economies are trying to aim for. And as we'll discuss later, the reason why we want to try and get one is lower rate is because capital is very movable. And in the digital age, it is even more movable. So with the paid parental leave, if you qualify, you have to earn up to $100,000, you'll get this paid parental leave. And again, there's not much in the budget that hadn't already been leaked or discussed or even part of the policies at the last election. And this is why we'll come to some further discussions. The company tax rate, of course, if you're company has a taxable income of less than $5 million from 1 July 2015, then the tax rate will be 28.5%. If your company has a taxable income greater than that, then you'll also pay a 1.5%, the parental leave levy. So this is targeted that big business pays parental leave, small business doesn't have to pay it. Now again, you look at it and you say, well, a small company, 28.5%, I'm an individual earning at and paying 49, now 50%. There's a tax, this is getting back to what you'd call capital management. How do you as an individual best structure your affairs to use this? The other interesting thing is, remember, the tax deficit levy or the budget repair levy is only there for 3 years. So that's a 2% delta for the next 3 years. So how are you going to reward yourself if you're in a private company? Equally, even in a public company, you've got the issues of, well, what are they going to do with franking credits? I've got a big stock of franking credits accumulated at 30%, tax rate now drops down to 28%. Will they, as they have in the past, give us some recognition for that drop? Equally, if private company trying to repay debt, there are some other mechanisms with the lower tax rate. Now clearly, this is all a discussion at the moment. There may be some integrity measures. They are addressing a number of integrity measures for corporates widely, typically on what they call, you would have seen it in the press, BEPS, B-E-P-S, which is base erosion and profit sharing, or profit shifting, which is basically, I'm moving all my activities offshore, or I'm a large IT company and I can set up anywhere in the world, and through transfer pricing I'll move it. Now, one of the IT companies that supposedly are under threat from the government and ATO actually has an agreement with the ATO about what they should be paying. So it seems rather bizarre that they're complaining about it when they've agreed to how much they should pay. So the decisions on capital management is basically, you're a private business person, then take a look and think about what you're going to do with your existing franking credits and your income over the next 3 years. Equally, because of the FBT rate, there are smaller arbitrages there as well. There were some other cuts. Obviously, the R&D concessions were changed because of the change in tax by 1.5% drop. Indexation of fuel excise, which seems to have got a lot of people excited, and that's going to be put into a special road fund. Health changes and co-payments. I won't steal any of Mark's thunder, but part of the health or the co-payment is to go into this medical fund. And for those of you who are old enough to remember the various development funds that the Victorian or South Australian governments had in the late 80s and early 90s, it's going to be interesting to see how the government can pick some winners with $20 billion out of this, as opposed to a sovereign wealth fund where they're investing passively to meet certain liabilities. The big one that may have skipped you, the seafarer tax offset. I was actually quite disappointed by this withdrawal. So unless you own a domestic sea operation and were employing, had a Barbados flag and employing Libyans, your opportunity for some tax planning sadly has now gone. So what of the future? Well, the federal budget addressed the Commonwealth. However, the states still have to borrow, and therefore at a federal level, we still have a problem. Therefore, by 2050, and we'll come to this shortly, by 2050, 48% of the debt, 48% of the state debt or the federal debt will have of GDP. So sorry, GDP, 48% of it will equal the debt that we've had to borrow for the states. Now, governments can say, oh, that's states and we're federal, and that's New South Wales and South Australia and Tasmania. The issue is there's an old Martin Luther King saying, which we may have arrived in different ships, but we're in the same boat now. And so when the global economy looks at us, or when we need to be resilient against the global economy, we are all in the same boat. And we can't have states defaulting. And those of you who are interested in economic history, Jack Lang tried that in New South Wales in the 1930s. So it doesn't tell a pretty picture. The other aspect of it is, because of that, there is what they call vertical fiscal imbalance, right? VFI, and you'll hear a lot of that. Basically, it says states spend the money, but they can't derive the revenue. Now, for those of you with a 16-year-old daughter, you'll know all about that. This question of imbalance, fiscal imbalance. Sometimes I feel like Angela Merkel bowing out Greece. But anyway, so the other aspect of it is that why are these monies growing so rapidly? Principally education and health. Education expenses are growing at a rate greater than CPI plus population increase. Health is growing at a rate greater than GDP. So forget about just CPI plus population increases. Health is going at a greater rate. And again, why is that? Well, the so-called number of trips to doctors. But then there's the issue around referrals for tests. Operations have increased, and the new generation of drugs as they're coming out. And I'm not to say that we need to, how do you balance a good society or a fair society against what do you give? But with the new drugs that are coming down, they are targeted. So these mass drugs that used to be like Lipitor, that could apply to the general population, the new drugs are actually targeted at individual diseases at individual people. And therefore that comes with a cost. All these giant machines all come at a cost as well. So with that, we've got a large number of expenses coming. The other aspect of it is there's a lot of medical expenses incurred in those last few months of a person's life. Now, interestingly enough, a stat out of the United States is 4 out of 5 people die in a hospital. 1 out of 5 doctors die in a hospital. So what do they know about dignity around death, as opposed to how long do? And I'm not saying we start pulling the plugs. There's laws against that. It is an issue that we need to address. Exactly. So the biggest cost happens in those last two. And you think about when you're basically, it's sort of like spending $80 million on finding a jet in the Indian Ocean. Now, the other reason why this is very important, though, is that you say, well, that debt, well, it's debt. If nothing changes, and our calculations bear out, if nothing changes, then that debt, the interest on that debt will be $166 billion per annum. That is bigger than the current New Zealand economy. So there is, out there on the future, there's smoke on the horizon. So I'm not saying it's going to happen today or tomorrow, but think about Ubermorgen. The day after tomorrow, it will happen. Now, let's get personal. So, okay, that's the macro sense. Now we're going to get right down to where it really counts. This is about bracket creep, or the nice technical term, fiscal drag. And the trouble is I shake too much, so I probably won't be able... there you go, look at that. That's where, in 2016, that's where average weekly earnings will now be in the second highest tax bracket again. Taxes do affect economic output, because people will say, well, if I'm working that much harder for that much lesser money, then why should I do that? It also affects participation, particularly of women, in that, well, if I'm returning to the workforce, I've got this benefit, but I return to the workforce, I've got childcare, tax rate, my effective tax rate, including childcare payments, can be astronomical. So again, it's a discouragement to participation. So what do we do about it? Well, given the competing demands on both services and the revenue that we we need a proper debate. And we need a proper debate that uses simple language around adequacy, around efficiency, and around equity. We also need to ensure that we communicate the economic imperative of why we need to change, and finally drive unity. Now, adequacy is about, as the nice term, fiscal sustainability. We need money to put services out there. So therefore, what is the level of money that governments at both levels need, or all three levels need, to be able to meet that? Efficiency is about administration, cost of collection, is it comparative or competitive against our global peers? And equity is about the burden to pay, and it's non-discriminatory. So we need to drive this, because unity, we've already had a number of tax reform reviews. So for those of you who remember the Henry Tax Reform Review? Yes. Well, out of that, there was 120 odd plus recommendations. Less than 5 or 6 were actually adopted, and even then only partially adopted, and some of them have now been thrown out. So you sort of say, well, Henry, why did you get out of bed that day? You might as well have just not done it. So we need to be able to ensure that we use this language, that we put the economic argument forward and drive unity. Because it's not about, as I was discussing previously with some of you, it's not about winners and losers. Because every day you pick up the paper, you go to the ABC website, read about the winners and losers of the federal budget. If we keep talking like that, what's going to happen? For those of you who are in large corporates or who have ever been in any change program, if you don't have consistency of language, you don't show the people the promised land or the reason why we need to change, and you talk about winners and losers, we're not going to get change. So, this is my language. I see taxes as part of your societal insurance premium, or it's your club membership. You want a good club, I'll pay some money. Otherwise, the club doesn't give you the facilities that you want. Now, the trouble is, though, that some taxes, sort of like an Orwellian speak, some taxes are good, some taxes are bad, and others are double bad, no good. And with that, we have done some work, and the OECD also have done it. So at a corporate tax level, that's probably bad. Stamp duties, like on transfer of real property, are bad because they limit economic activity. Because instead of saying, I will sell this block of land for the best use, I'll hold on to it, because if I'm downsizing, I've got a family home, and I'll downsize, and if it's going to cost me an additional $40,000 to $50,000 in stamp duty on top of my other transaction costs, well, I might as well just stay here. But I don't need a family home. A young family which could do with it is missing out on it. And there are many examples of where activities, including business activities, are hampered because of stamp duty. Corporate tax, we discussed about this whole idea about corporates. Capital is fungible. You can move it anywhere. However, at the top of the tree is obviously land tax, and the ACT have adopted that over stamp duty, because one of the good things about land is that you can't move it, so it's easy to tax. GST, whilst it does have an impact, GST, if you can manage the welfare aspects to make compensation, equally, GST it doesn't really affect choices. People say it does, but it doesn't. And in fact, we say we've got a 10% GST rate. That 10% only applies to some 60% of our total consumption. So therefore, we're only talking about on the economy a GST rate of 6%. If we increased it and expanded the scope, and we can talk about this later, you could end up with an additional 15 billion plus or minus what welfare payments you might need to make. So look, in conclusion, and go back to Mr. McCorber. Mr. McCorber, the only supporter that Mr. McCorber had was his long-suffering wife, because Mr. McCorber was thrown in jail. And you probably see Joe Hockey looking for his Mrs. McCorber to come out in support of him. The issue, though, what we need to do is move beyond this budget and start addressing tax reform as we discussed. And that means getting government, academia and business on side. And in fact, it also starts with us here in this room, because we are graduates of Melbourne Business School. We can have this argument and discussion. And for those of you who remember your negotiations, we've got to move past the issues and the positions that we all take and focus on the real common interests that we need to do so as to get this place moving against the backdrop of adequacy, efficiency and equity. Mark.
Just as Mark's presenting there, a couple of things he said that I'd like to pick up on just briefly before I forget. I think the majority of economists, certainly my fields and my PhD degree were public finance and what they call monetary economics. And in public finance, the basic sort of principle is that you want to tax things that don't distort behaviour very much, or distort behaviours in ways that you desire. So in the old days, we used to have budgets and the headlines in the newspaper were just beer up, cigs up. And that, to economists, the party poopers, was actually a good thing, because yes, you distort behaviour, people smoke less and drink less maybe, but that's not such a bad thing. For the federal budget, what are the things that we want to move people away from? Well, a GST is a good thing because it should increase people's savings and decrease consumption to some extent. But as Mark said, also with a good tax system, you want to have simplicity and you want to have efficiency in terms of generating revenues. And Mark mentioned $15 billion that we could generate through increasing or broadening the base of the GST. I would suggest that doubling the GST to 20% and broadening the base and generating another $50 billion, even with significant compensation for lower income earners, would be a direction that we ought to consider. And certainly, in terms of obligations in the future that I'll come to in a moment, that might be something that we need to do to generate the revenues to pay for the health and issues with the ageing population that we have. And that would allow reductions in corporate tax rates, payroll taxes at the state level, and income taxes. And as long as you address the equity issues around that, I think that's the direction we ought to be at least discussing. And unfortunately, in the Henry Review, the GST was left out. So we didn't even have that discussion when we were supposed to be having a discussion about the tax system. And so that brings me to some of the things that I will talk about. I thought I'd talk about the philosophy of this budget and the philosophy of fiscal policy more generally. And then I'll talk very briefly about the economic projections. I used to be in the forecasting group in the Treasury, and you might think that the forecasts are political coming out of the government, but they're not really. There's a group that comprises some political appointees, I guess, the Treasury, the Reserve Bank, and some private forecasters that come in and sort of check the numbers. And the reality is the forecasts aren't really political. Economic forecasts are sometimes difficult, so they miss, but they're not really that political. So I won't talk too much about the projections unless you're interested. I'll pick up on a few policies, some that I'm interested in, and then some that I thought that you would be interested in. And then I'll give the budget a grade. We'll see if it passes. The philosophy, I apologise, perhaps the text there is a little bit small for you, but this is from the Commission of Audit, which I actually think was a good process. The Commission of Audit was appointed by the government to look at what the government might do in the way of fiscal policy in the coming years. As with the tax review, only a few of the sort of suggestions and principles from the Commission of Audit were picked up on. But these are the principles of good government that it's at the start of the Commission of Audit report. And I think you could argue that because the Commission of Audit, the commissioners were appointed by the Liberals, they had an ideological position. But I think these principles or this philosophy in terms of what a government should do are pretty reasonable. And both sides of government would have leeway to do what they want, even adhering to these principles. So principle number one is live within your means. And of course we've had Joe Hockey repeat over and over again that one of the things that he wants to do is reduce debt. And I guess that's not an unreasonable position to take. And as Mark said, I think the issue is not so much in the next year or 2 or 5 or even 10 years. It's really an issue as to what the Australian Federation faces in the next 30 or 40 years as the population ages. That's the real issue. And we need to start preparing for and addressing some issues around that today. Harness the benefits of the Federation. There's lots of issues with duplication and so on with our structure, our government structure. I think some of the things that were suggested in the report that were quite sensible was that essentially the government should provide services, the layer of government that should provide services should be closest to the people that are being served. And I guess economists would argue that national defence is an obvious example that is quite rightly provided by the federal government. Education is tricky. Some would say it should be a federal responsibility. In my view, I think the states should have the responsibility for education. That would give you diversity, which I think is a good thing. Some would think it's not such a good thing. But there could be debate about education. With health, I think again, you could argue either way, but my view would be that the state governments should have responsibility for health, and therefore they should be raising the revenues to pay for those services. The third principle is protect the truly disadvantaged. And one of the things that we need to have a discussion in Australia about, and this budget brought about a discussion in a very clumsy way, is who is looked after in the federal budget. And I think the truly disadvantaged are the ones who should be looked after, but people in the second quintile of the income distribution, and certainly the third quintile of the income distribution, probably shouldn't be looked after. You can't afford to look after people who are on median income. The problem is, and it was Liberals who really discovered this, the third quintile is where the median voter sits. They're the people who swing the election. And John Howard gave away the goodies of the mining boom to the middle class. And clawing back those revenues has been very challenging for this government and will be very challenging for both sides of politics. And there's all kinds of areas where not just welfare, but services need to be targeted to those who are truly disadvantaged and not provided for free to everyone. The budget's taken some steps in those directions, but we need to have a more careful and clear debate about those issues. I won't pick up on all of those, but be transparent and honest. Reducing complexity. Avoid regulation as a first response to a problem. One of the things that I do teach in my class is that there are market failures. There are methods that you can use to address market failures, but sometimes you may as well leave the market failures sit because the solution is worse than the problem. So those are the principles that, again, I think the philosophy there is quite sound. The budget has picked up on the living within your means or reducing the debt. Joe Hockey seems to mention this $667 billion over and over again as where the budget is headed in the debt is headed in the next few years. That's the gross level of debt, and there is a need to reduce that. User pays and targeting of welfare is consistent with the principles of good government. Whether a lower commitment to foreign aid and an increased commitment to defence is consistent with good government is, I think, arguable. But we can talk about that in the questions. In terms of the reducing the debt, one of the things that was interesting in the budget is there are a number of tables that were new in the budget, in the various budget papers. And these tables were new, these graphs I should say. And they show very clearly that Australia has an increasing path of debt. The budget puts in place the green instead of the blue, and so reducing debt out to 2024-25. The increase in net debt is one of the highest increases both over projected over the next few years in the OECD. But that is partly, of course, because Greece on the left simply can't afford to spend any more money. In the past budgets, they used to have this slide, which is the comparison of Australia's net debt with other countries. And while I would say that keeping the debt on a sustainable path is desirable. It's not the case that Australia's net debt position is, well, certainly admirable, desirable relative to other OECD economies in general. So compared to the Euro area or the US or the UK or Japan or Greece or Italy or Portugal, etc., our debt position is very strong. So it's not the case that if we didn't have health and ageing population issues about to hit us, that our debt is particularly problematic. Now, so this is why, even though our debt position is reasonably good, we need to think about fiscal sustainability in the longer term. The two issues are health and education. The panel on the right there is from the Productivity Commission and some research that they've done, looking at how health expenditure, child-related expenditure and aged expenditure changes over the next 30 years. And of course we do have fewer young people, so education costs should fall. This is particularly primary and secondary education costs. As a share of GDP, these numbers are. But the real problem is around age-related spending, and even in Australia we have significant increases in pension costs under the status quo, and health-related spending is the big one. This is the real issue for all OECD economies, is we can either accept growing healthcare obligations and costs because we've got an ageing population and we can put up taxes as a result, or we can do something about this. We can either provide services more efficiently, somehow, or we can make individuals rather than the government pay and provide for some of these services. But there's no other way around this. We can't provide the services and not have them increasing in terms of costs. And in terms of the total cost as a share of GDP, it's somewhere between 6.5% or, in worst case, 10% of GDP. Now, that might not sound like a lot, but if you think about it, the government's 25 to 30% of GDP. It might require a 30 or 40% increase in taxes if we just accepted the status quo and raised taxes to deal with that. Because the government is not 100% of the economy, that is a major cost that has to be borne because of the ageing population. And so the Commission of Audit's chart in terms of projected Commonwealth spending is suggesting that even over the next 10 years, these costs increase very dramatically. And it's health and education, health and age-related expenditure, the light blue in the left panel, that's the real issue that we have to address. So I took me a little bit of time to figure out what people were talking about when they talked about the fact, commentators talked about the fact that the states have lost $80 billion out of the federal budget. What's going on there? Well, what's going on there is the Labor government agreed to these very significant increases in spending in health and education beyond 2016-2017. Promised the states this funding, which is the light green line in the two panels there for schools and for hospitals. In the current budget, what they've done is say we will give you another roughly 3.5% a year for schools and education beyond 2016-2017, and that's all we can guarantee you at that point, beyond that point. And if you integrate the areas between the green dashed line and the blue line, that comes to $80 billion less than what the states were previously promised. Now, you might think that's terrible, it's a bad thing, but I guess the reality, as I've said already, is that we have to find ways to deal with these rising costs. I guess it's a pretty crude way really to just say you're not getting the money, provide the services, which is kind of where we are now. But we know, as I've said, we have to still provide the services, but we have to find other sources of funding, private sources of funding I'd suggest, as well as think about efficiencies and delivering services in an equitable manner. So we need somehow to figure out how to square this circle over the next 2 or 3 years. But the states, I guess, have to realise that the previous promise of funding wasn't really reasonable or sustainable. Now, other things in the budget, the user pays and targeting of welfare. In terms of user pays, I'll come back to university fees, GP contributions in a moment. We have tightening of eligibility for family transfer benefits that Mark's spoken about. One of the issues, I think, has been that in terms of targeting welfare, this budget has not done a very good job. And I'll show you some numbers on that in a moment. And I think in terms of the sell, that's where the Treasurer has really kind of let himself down. I think this budget would have been a lot easier to sell if the truly disadvantaged had been looked after in this budget. And the problem is they haven't really been looked after. And I'll show you some numbers on that in a moment. I'll show you some numbers here. There's been some debate in the last few days about some numbers that have come out of the National Centre for Economic Modelling at ANU that have suggested various losses for certain types of individuals. And it's often been commented that there's nothing in the budget about the distributional impacts of the budget, which is not really fair, because in the budget there's a whole range of tables which have the outcomes for people in different categories. So sole parents, families, couples with 2 children, couples with 1 children, on different incomes and so on. So there's about 7 or 8 or 9 tables showing what happens to different individuals. I guess, again, my view is that we should look after the more disadvantaged through the budget. The sole parent table here is the one I've just picked from the budget. And there's a couple of interesting things here. If I haven't put it up here, but if you compare this with other groups in terms of the treatment of other groups in the budget, sole parents on low incomes here do very poorly out of this budget. So again, those are the sorts of people you probably should be looking after in the budget.
Actually, if we incentivize people to be sole parents, like giving them money, I think this is exactly why the budget is going to
Well, but you're here, one of the things, we can talk about that, but one of the things I want to talk about here is that you're incentivizing people to stay sole parents with low incomes. That's the bigger problem. And where's your pointer, Mark? Have we lost it? Sorry. I've only been a professor for 20 years. Look at the person here on a very low income, on $20,000 or $30,000. What happens to them as they go from $30,000 to $40,000 or $40,000 to $50,000? From $40,000 to $50,000, after benefits and tax, their income goes from $50,000, because they're getting transfers, to $53,000. An effective marginal tax rate of about 75%. In other words, that person has no incentive to get out and get a job and get working. By the time you take into consideration the costs of going to work, psychological of course, and the actual transport costs and so on. So this is, economists have been complaining about this for years, that the effective marginal tax rates that low-income earners face in this country are horrific. They're much worse than the 49 or 50% that high-income earners face. And the budget has made this worse rather than better in some cases. So part of this is an issue with how you deal with the distributional consequences of the budget, and part is this issue of we still haven't addressed the tax benefit interaction properly in Australia at all. Got some more on that. There's also this table which shows average transfers and tax paid by income group, and it shows very little difference there. I guess, again, economists would say, well, the transfers probably should come down here, go up a little bit more, but it's hard to see from the budget papers what exactly is going on there. Couple more slides. Economic projections, very, very briefly. One of the challenges for both sides of politics in framing budgets recently is revenues have been low, despite the economy doing reasonably well. There's a number of reasons why revenues have been low. One has been that real GDP, the economy is still kicking along, 3%, maybe not quite as well as it was. The problem is nominal GDP, which drives tax revenue, has not been growing so quickly. And there's a reason that economists would kind of know as to what's going on there. The terms of trade have been declining. And what that means is that nominal GDP hasn't been growing as quickly as it was when the terms of trade were increasing. And so the Treasury is forecasting that the terms of trade will continue to decline. And without sort of going through the stuff on the slide there, that's a big part of the challenge for the next 2 or 3 years in terms of revenues are projected not to grow very quickly because the terms of trade are predicted to decline. Now, as an economist, I would say terms of trade are notoriously difficult to predict, and maybe we should just predict the random walk. They are where they are today in 2 or 3 years' time. But I do think the Treasury is probably sensible and conservative to take the view that, well, let's forecast terms of trade weakening. Because if China slows down, they're going to weaken a lot. And so this budget is still riding on China growing at the forecast in the budget is sort of declining to about 6.75%. As those of you who've done my classes know, I talk a lot about China and the fact that that's a reasonable forecast, but there are a lot of risks around the China economy right at the moment. And so there is a risk that revenues could fall even further because China slows and the terms of trade slows. So that's a major thing that's kind of hanging in the economic projections. Last couple of points. In terms of the specific policies, hypothecation. And anyone who's not done economics doesn't even know what that means, and it's all kind of very boring, and it sounds very sensible when you understand what it is. Hypothecation is where you impose a fuel levy and you use the revenues from the fuel levy for roads, which is in the budget. You impose a GP co-payment and you use the revenues from that to put in a fund to fund medical research. So the revenues are hypothecated for a particular purpose. And economists hate that because the whole point of government is you raise taxes in the most efficient way possible and you spend where you need to spend. But you don't earmark for particular purposes. It's stupid. But in Australia we have had more and more hypothecated taxes. Fuel levy, Medicare levy, high income earners levy, hypothecated for the budget. So hypothecation is a really bad idea. And hypothecating $20 billion for medical research is stupid. The outcome should be better health. And it's extremely questionable as to whether a $20 billion fund earmarked just for health is better than for chemistry or something else or anything else, or to pay off the debt or whatever else. It's a way of trying to sell the budget because the GP co-payments have a particular medically related purpose. But I think it's very poor public policy. And happy to take that up again in the questions. Very briefly, in terms of environmental policy, also very poor. Direct action is very expensive, and I don't think you'd find any economists arguing, no matter what you think about climate change economics, direct action is expensive and arguable how effective it would be relative to carbon taxes or a quota regime, which would raise revenue. GP co-payments, economists generally I think would think it's a good idea to have the user pay. Universal healthcare is a reasonable idea, but that doesn't mean nobody pays for it. So I think you can have GP co-payments with protections for those on low incomes and still provide good healthcare service. And again, in terms of addressing these longer term issues, I think that's important. And university deregulation. In the Commission of Audit, they estimated that the personal benefit from a university education was about 55% of the cost of provision. In other words, if it costs $10,000 to provide a commerce degree, then the individual should bear about $5,500 of that annual cost because that's the benefit the individual gets. And society gets a benefit from having a more educated workforce, a more educated population. So it's reasonable to think that the individual pays something. The question is how much. I think it's arguable whether 55% is the right number or whether it's 35 or 65. But again, in terms of cost and obligations in the future, I think it's fair that individuals pay more for their university education. And Christopher Pyne got himself in a little bit of a sort of mess on the ABC last night talking about this issue because the presenter said, well, you know, these people who earn higher incomes in the future also pay higher taxes in the future, which is true. But you need to separate out those two issues. We pay higher taxes on higher incomes because we think progressive taxes are fair, and I think that's reasonable. but it's also the case that individuals should pay costs where they yield benefits. And in the case of education, the private benefits are very significant. So I think you can have both. You can have a progressive tax system, and you can have people paying 50% of the cost of their education. And again, there's been a lot of scaremongering about the implications of this for fees, and I guess the reality is we won't know until we see more detail. But I think the general principle of deregulating universities and having GP co-payments are quite reasonable. Overall, I would give the budget a pass. I think it started to push us in the right direction in terms of thinking about and addressing these debt issues. Clearly, the communication is a big problem. I think the distributional issues are not as tightly targeted as they need to be. So I've only given it a C+. Tax changes are very clumsy and complex, and Mark would agree. I think we need in this country to rip up the tax code and start again. And I don't know whether he would agree with me that the GST should be 20%, but I think we would both agree that the GST should be higher. Personal distortionary taxes in general should be lower in Australia. I'll leave it at that.
We've got a few minutes for questions, so if anyone does want to ask a question, please. Either of the Marks, I'm sure, are quite happy to take questions.
Mark? Just
Depends upon how hard it is.
It's about the medical research fund, like $7 billion. What's the balance? Like, how much do they predict to raise? And then if health is a state issue instead of federal, how are they going to allocate it?
Yeah, so that's the projection of what that co-payment would raise over the 3 or 4 or 5 years.
Right.
How is it it's not going to be allocated to the states because it's the medical research fund. And so there will be a huge bun fight if they ever get to once they start allocating funds over who gets the fund. So we know what will happen in our federation. Whatever it is, 16.6% of the funds will go to someone in Victoria and 16.6% to someone in New South Wales and so on.
Oh, so that's how it's going to be allocated?
Oh, no, that's how the political process will lead to. I was on ABC in Hobart last week, and they asked me if the budget was fair for Tasmania, and I said, well, you're 2.5% of the population, you've got 2.5% of infrastructure funding, so you got what you deserved. I sort of. That's.
Yes, please. There was a lot of emphasis on the government debt, and you showed it's about 20%, but they never talk about private debt here in Australia that is about $1.8 trillion, which is quite substantial, and talking about the Henry tax review about maybe abolishing negative gearing. Does the government is concerned about this huge amount of private debt and what they're planning to do about it?
Well, I guess with any debt, so this is the issue with gross versus net debt. So the government's gross debt is projected to rise to 667 billion, as Joe Hockey kept on saying. But the government has future fund assets and other assets. I mean, the Greeks have the Acropolis and all those wonderful ruins that they can sell. They've got lots of assets, right? The reasonable assets that you can kind of use, I guess, to earmark or offset against gross debt would be, in Australia, the future fund. This financial asset, perfectly reasonable. And there are other assets, so the net debt is this number on the slide here. For individuals, I guess the same principle, right? So what's the gross debt? The gross debt is actually quite high. I'm trying to remember the precise numbers, or rough numbers as they do now, it'd be about 40 or 50%, or maybe more than that, of GDP. So that's quite high, but of course we've got assets, housing in particular, sitting behind that. And so the question is, are the assets likely to decline in value? Are they generating sufficient return? So in Australia, you're right, the negative gearing, we have too much an incentive to invest in housing and not enough incentive to invest in entrepreneurial activity and innovation and things like that. That's partly because the income tax regime is high relative to our partners. But it's really about the assets sitting behind that debt. I mean, that's another thing I guess I would pick up on in the budget, and the questions in the ABC last night to Christopher Pine were about how we sit relative to the OECD. We shouldn't be comparing ourselves with the OECD anymore. We should be comparing ourselves to the countries in the region that are a lot more dynamic and have quite different, obviously we don't want to have a Vietnamese health system or education system, but we probably want to look at Singapore and some other models which are very innovative and nimble and address some of these issues around innovation and entrepreneurship in interesting ways.
With our modelling, when you look at debt levels of the other places around the world, what is the world economy going to look like in 20 or 30 years' time? If Australia is potentially in strife, if you look at the knock-on effect of Europe on the rest of the world or America on the rest of the world, those guys are in even more strife. So does it matter really what Australia does? We're in strife with the rest of the world. We just batten up the hatches and pretend the Pacific and Atlantic are big enough to keep away from them. What's going to happen?
I'd answer that two ways. The first way is around this issue, and I'll let Mark answer the sort of the global economic. My view is getting back to why, fundamentally we want to try and get rid of the debt is because of having a budget in surplus and having little debt helped us get through the GFC. There are, as you can see, other shocks that could quite possibly come out there. And we only look at world equity markets at the moment. Everyone's sitting on cash. No one's doing it. I think, well, why not? Well, one day Putin decides, I'll invade the next country, So these economic shocks mean that we need to manage our affairs better so as that if we require stimulus to keep our population going or our country going, then we're in a position to do it. I always like, when people compare us to anyone, it's sort of like, we've got the lowest level of domestic violence in the world. Well, hooray, I'd like zero domestic violence. It's, why compare yourself to something on a meaningless, what I believe is a meaningless number, whereas going to, compare ourselves to a Singapore, China and what have you, how are they doing it? So as how are they encouraging growth, with their sovereign wealth funds, with their pension funds?
Yeah, I mean, the short answer is Europe is a great place for a holiday, but I wouldn't rely on their economy in the next 10 or 20 years. These problems are horrific for European economies that have already declining workforces and very large levels of debt. And the US is only better because their demography is better. They still have immigration, they have population growth in advance of many European countries and Japan.
Well, in fact, they're better than China.
And China has some of these issues as well.
They're still the reserve currency, so they can almost get away with it.
For the moment, they are.
Yeah, for the moment.
Yeah.
Can I just ask about the robustness of the figures in terms of demographics? You mentioned demographics for the States, well, relatively favourable. Australia can be as favourable as it wants to be, depending upon the level of migration. That's one. The second thing is anybody thinking about positive health in terms of diet, exercise, education, whatever, so that we make our population healthier, reduce health costs? So demographics, age mix, and then health.
I think it's in the Commission of Audit, they looked at whether immigration could, how much, I was in the Productivity Commission report, how much immigration could undo an ageing population, and I can't remember whether they were looking at whether it could maintain the current working age population ratio to that currently. And Australia would need to have a bigger population than Japan by the 2050s. So we have immigration, but we don't have anywhere near enough immigration to keep the current working age population as a ratio to total anywhere near where it currently is. And of course, politically, I think that would be very difficult for the government to get to 70 or 80 million people by 2050. So that's not going to happen. Again, demographics does help Australia and the US. We have a higher immigration ratio than the US or Canada, so than other OECD countries. And second question around positive health, I agree. I think, and this is part of the issue of starting to raise this issue of the health care costs going to where they're going, is we need to have individuals take responsibility and therefore take some of these actions, but also perhaps to redirect funding in ways that discourages, cigs up. Beer,
Took away alcohol, I had nothing left.
Mark, for with a purple tie. I'm colourblind. For Joe Hockey, he's only got a C+ grade on this assignment. So he comes to your office and he says, Mark, I want to get an A, an H1. What would you say to him?
I mean, obviously, it's all very easy to sort of take pot shots from here. You've got to recognise the political realities. But communication is the key. He was focused very much on the debt and the debt being problematic. And there are plenty of positive ways to address the issues around health and ageing populations, I think, in the way of just suggested around, okay, we need to take more individual responsibility. The Commission of Audit has raised these issues. In terms of tax, I would argue that we need to start again. We do need to actually scrap the current tax systems and have a proper Henry review with the GST in it. And in the state budget, the payroll tax was reduced. That's a good thing. We would all agree with that. It was reduced from 4.9 to 4.85%, which I think is the lowest among the states, but the threshold for businesses is also the lowest. So that's a very distorting tax. You're charging people to hire people. You don't want to do that. So we need to really reorient our tax system. I think that's a fundamental one. And so they need to have a proper, serious tax reform and throw everything in the mix, whatever their promises were before the election.
So we talk about the need for tax reform and what should and could happen. Do you want to have a crack at what's going to happen? Do you want to go on what you think may pan out in the next 5 to 10 years?
Look, with tax reform, I look at New Zealand, and whilst I've got being a rugby player, I've got a litany of New Zealand jokes. You'd have to say they have done a fantastic job. They've got a corporate tax rate of 28%, top personal tax rate of 33%, so little arbitrage opportunities. It's probably not worth it on a long-term basis compared to 28 to 50 odd here. And they've got a GST of 15, and they're in budget surplus. The way they've also managed their economy. Fonterra, I think, is a great story of where they said, look, ignore ACCC type issues domestically. Because we're so small, we need to bat above our weight, therefore let's just make one mega dairy company. And that way we can compete on the world. We're, 2% of the world economy, roughly? 1%, okay. It's gone down. I didn't know we've taken that long. And so, how do we, get industries and part of tax? How do we encourage it? And there's a lot of stuff that wasn't in the budget. There's some good news stuff that we know that Hockey's looking at as well, but didn't want to cloud it, in this particular budget.
I think maybe that's the appropriate place to, and it's very sad when New Zealand is our role model. I think we should all adjourn and have a drink and take any further questions out